"You don't belong in this room," Charlotte Hayes said, her voice sharp enough to slice through the low hum of conversation, and just like that, every head in the glass-walled conference room turned toward the man standing near the far end of the table. Daniel Brooks didn't move, didn't flinch, didn't even blink, and for a moment it almost felt like the words had passed straight through him, like wind through an open door. Charlotte leaned back in her chair, crossing one leg over the other with effortless precision, her tailored suit catching the morning light that poured in from the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking downtown, a skyline built on power and decisions made by people exactly like her. "I asked a simple question," she continued, tapping her pen once against the polished oak table, "and instead of an answer I get silence." A few quiet chuckles rippled through the room, subtle at first, then growing just enough to be noticed but not enough to be called out. Daniel stood there in his plain button-down shirt, sleeves rolled just past his wrists, his posture straight but unassuming, like a man who had learned long ago that standing tall didn't require taking up space. "If you're going to be in my meetings," Charlotte added, her tone dipping into something colder, more deliberate, "you should at least be capable of contributing." Another pause, another wave of restrained laughter, and this time someone near the middle of the table shifted in their seat, glancing between them as if unsure whether to look away or lean in. Daniel's eyes moved slowly across the room, not searching, not pleading, just observing, and when they finally settled on Charlotte, there was no anger in them, no embarrassment, no urgency to defend himself, just a quiet stillness that didn't match the moment at all. "Well?" she pressed, lifting her chin slightly, expecting resistance, expecting something she could push against, something she could win. Nothing came. 3 seconds passed, then 5, then 10, and in a world where silence usually meant weakness, this one felt different, heavier, like it carried something no one in the room could quite name. The air shifted, subtle but undeniable, the kind of shift that happens right before a storm when everything goes still. Charlotte's fingers paused against her pen, just for a fraction of a second, before she set it down with a soft click, masking the hesitation behind a thin smile. "That's what I thought," she said, waving a dismissive hand as if closing a file that wasn't worth her time, and just like that, the room exhaled, laughter returning in scattered bursts, people leaning back into their roles, their comfort, their hierarchy. Daniel nodded once, almost imperceptibly, then turned and walked toward the door. His steps measured, unhurried, each one echoing faintly against the marble floor. No slammed doors, no dramatic exits, just a man leaving a room that had already decided who he was. Behind him, the meeting resumed, voices overlapping, charts flickering back onto the screen, Charlotte already redirecting the conversation as if nothing unusual had happened. But as Daniel's hand reached the brushed steel handle and the door opened with a quiet hiss, something lingered, something unspoken that hung in the space he left behind. Because for the first time in a room built on dominance and control, the loudest moment hadn't been Charlotte's words, it had been his silence. If you're enjoying this story, please subscribe and turn on the notification bell. It really helps the channel and means a lot to us. Now let's go on. The door closed behind Daniel with a soft click that barely registered above the hum of conversation returning to full volume, but the sound seemed to linger longer than it should have, like an echo that refused to fade. Inside the conference room, Charlotte Hayes continued speaking, her voice steady, precise, outlining quarterly projections and risk assessments as if nothing had interrupted the flow, as if the moment from seconds ago had already been filed away and forgotten. "We adjust the forecast by 3%, she said, gesturing toward the screen, "and we move forward." Heads nodded, pens scribbled, laptops clicked, the rhythm of control re-established. Yet something underneath it all felt slightly off, like a note just out of tune. "Did you see his face?" Someone whispered from the far end of the table, not quite quiet enough, followed by a low chuckle. "Guy did not even try to defend himself," another voice added, softer, almost curious. "Maybe he did not have anything to say." A third replied quickly, dismissively, and the small pocket of laughter returned, filling the space Daniel had left behind. Charlotte did not look up, but her pen paused again, hovering just above her notebook before continuing its smooth, deliberate motion. "Focus," she said without raising her voice, and the room snapped back into alignment. Outside, Daniel walked down the long corridor lined with glass panels and muted reflections, the city stretching out beyond them in steel and sunlight, his footsteps even unhurried, each one landing with quiet certainty. A junior analyst stepped aside to let him pass, offering a brief glance that lingered half a second too long, as if searching for something in his expression. Something that might confirm the story already forming in the room behind him. Daniel gave nothing, not a smile, not a frown, just the same steady presence that seemed untouched by what had just happened. In the elevator, the doors slid shut with a soft chime, sealing him into a small mirrored space where the noise of the office faded into a distant murmur. For a moment, there was only the low hum of machinery and the faint flicker of fluorescent light overhead. He adjusted his sleeve, a simple, practical motion, then rested his hands loosely at his sides, his reflection staring back at him not as a defeated man, but as someone who had already moved past the moment others were still replaying. Back upstairs, Charlotte continued. "We do not build this company on hesitation," she said, her tone sharper now, as if reinforcing something unspoken. "We build it on clarity." But even as she spoke, her eyes flicked once toward the empty space near the door where Daniel had been standing, just a fraction of a second, just enough to register the absence. She looked away immediately, continuing her explanation, yet the image lingered, not of his silence, but of the way he had held it, like it had weight, like it had purpose. The meeting pushed on, numbers replacing tension, structure replacing uncertainty, but beneath the surface, something had shifted, subtle and quiet, the kind of shift no one would acknowledge out loud. Because laughter fades, words blur, but silence, when it carries dignity, does something different. It stays, it settles, and sometimes it begins to ask questions no one is ready to answer. By the time the meeting ended, the energy in the room had settled into something quieter, but not calmer, like a lake after a stone had been thrown, the surface smooth again yet still carrying unseen ripples beneath. Chairs slid back, laptops snapped shut, and small clusters of employees formed near the glass walls, their voices low but active, curiosity threading through their words. "I mean, if that were me, I would have said something," one analyst murmured, shaking his head. "Anything," another replied. "You cannot just stand there and take it." A third voice cut in, softer, more thoughtful. "Maybe he was not taking it." That earned a pause, brief but noticeable, before someone scoffed lightly. "Come on, that was not strength, that was just nothing." The group shifted, half convinced, half unsure, because something about the moment did not sit as neatly as they wanted it to. Across the room, Charlotte gathered her tablet and notes with practiced efficiency, her movements precise, controlled, every gesture reinforcing the authority she carried so effortlessly, yet her mind did not move on as quickly as her hands did. "He should not even be in those meetings," Mark Ellison, her senior operations manager, said as he approached, his tone confident, almost eager to align. "You made the right call." Charlotte gave a small nod, the kind that acknowledged agreement without inviting further discussion. "We do not tolerate dead weight," she replied, her voice even, but as she spoke, the words felt slightly heavier than usual, like they were being measured against something she could not quite define. Mark continued, "People like him slow everything down, no edge, no presence." Charlotte glanced toward the door again, the same door Daniel had walked through minutes earlier, now closed. Silent, ordinary, and yet it held her attention for just a fraction too long before she looked away. "Presence," she repeated quietly, almost to herself, then straightened, her expression resetting into its usual composed clarity. "Make sure the revised projections are on my desk by 5. Mark nodded quickly and moved off, leaving her standing alone for a brief moment in the now nearly empty room. The sunlight had shifted, casting longer shadows across the polished table, and the city beyond. The glass seemed farther away somehow, distant and detached. Charlotte walked toward the window, her heels clicking softly against the floor, each step measured, intentional, but her thoughts were not as aligned as her stride. She replayed it, not the words she had said, those were routine, sharp but controlled. No, it was his stillness that returned, the way he had not resisted, not agreed, not reacted at all, as if the moment had not required anything from him. "Why did he not respond?" she murmured under her breath, not expecting an answer, because the question itself felt misplaced in a world where reactions were currency and silence was usually a loss. Yet this had not felt like a loss. She exhaled slowly, turning away from the window, dismissing the thought with a subtle shake of her head as if clearing static from a signal. "Irrelevant," she said quietly, reclaiming her focus, because in her world, clarity was everything, and anything that could not be defined was not worth holding on to. But as she walked out of the room, the echo of that silence followed her. Not loud, not intrusive, just present, like a question waiting patiently for the right moment to be understood. The late afternoon light stretched long across the quiet street as Daniel pulled his old pickup truck into the narrow driveway, the engine humming softly before settling into silence, A different kind of silence than the one he had left behind hours earlier, this one warm, familiar, earned. He stepped out, grabbing a worn canvas bag from the passenger seat, and for a moment he stood there, looking at the small house in front of him, its paint slightly faded, the porch light already uneven. Though the sun had not fully set, like someone inside had been waiting. The front door opened before he could reach it, and a small voice broke through the stillness. "Dad, you are late?" Lily Brooks stood barefoot on the porch, her hair pulled into a loose ponytail, a sketchbook tucked under one arm, her eyes bright but searching, the way children look when they are trying to read something unspoken. Daniel's expression softened, the edges of the day dissolving without effort. Traffic was slower than usual, he said gently, setting his bag down as he stepped up. "Did you finish your homework?" She nodded quickly, then held up the sketchbook. "And I drew something." He crouched slightly to her level, his voice quieter now, steady in a different way. "Let me see." She opened the page, revealing a careful drawing of two figures standing side by side, one taller, one smaller, both facing what looked like a horizon filled with light. "That is us," she said, matter of fact, as if it required no explanation. Daniel studied it for a moment, not just the lines but the intention behind them, the quiet certainty. "It is good," he said, and the words carried weight because he did not say things he did not mean. Inside, the house held the scent of something simple cooking, the low hum of an old radio playing in the background, a space untouched by boardrooms or sharp voices, where time moved differently, slower, more honest. Lily moved ahead of him into the kitchen, talking about a math problem and a classmate who could not stop tapping his pencil, her words flowing freely, unfiltered, and Daniel listened, really listened, the way he always did, nodding occasionally, asking small questions, never rushing her to the end. "Did something happen at work?" she asked suddenly, turning to look at him with that same searching gaze, the kind that saw more than most people realized. Daniel paused for a fraction of a second, then reached for a glass, filling it with water. "Nothing that matters," he replied, not dismissing, not hiding, just placing the moment where it belonged. She watched him for another second, then accepted it, because children who grow up around quiet strength learn to trust what is not said as much as what is. Later, as the evening settled in and the sky outside dimmed into deep blue, Daniel sat at the small kitchen table with Lily beside him, helping her adjust a line in her drawing, his hand guiding hers just enough to steady it, not control it. The light above them flickered softly, casting a warm glow over the scene, and for a moment everything felt complete, balanced, untouched by the noise of the world beyond those walls. But even here in the calm, there was a trace of something carried over, not tension, not frustration, just the quiet residue of a day that had tested nothing except how much a man needed to prove. And Daniel had already decided long ago that some things did not need proving at all. And somewhere across the city, in a building of glass and steel, a question still lingered unanswered, while here in a house built on something simpler, the answer had already been lived. The city lights stretched endlessly beneath Charlotte Hayes as she stood alone in her corner office, the glass walls reflecting a version of her that looked composed, controlled, untouchable, and yet there was a stillness in the room that did not match the usual rhythm of her world. Her tablet lay untouched on the desk, the numbers and projections from earlier now irrelevant in a way she could not logically justify, and for the third time in less than an hour, her mind drifted back to a man who had offered nothing, said nothing, and somehow left more of an impression than anyone else in that room combined. "It does not make sense," she said quietly to herself, her voice barely above a whisper, as if saying it out loud might force it into clarity. She walked slowly toward the window, heels muted against the carpet, the skyline glowing with power and ambition, a world she understood completely, a world where reactions were currency and dominance was language. And yet today, something had disrupted that system in a way she could not measure. "He should have pushed back," she muttered, her fingers resting lightly against the cool glass. "Anyone would have." But the more she repeated it, the less convincing it sounded. Her reflection stared back at her, sharp, confident, but with a faint crease between her brows that had not been there that morning. Behind her, the office door opened softly and Mark Ellison stepped in without hesitation, a folder in hand. "Charlotte, I have the revised numbers you asked for," he said, placing it neatly on her desk, but when she did not immediately respond, he hesitated. "Everything okay?" She turned slightly, her expression resetting almost instantly. "Fine," she replied, too quickly then corrected her tone, "just thinking." Mark nodded, though his eyes lingered for a moment, sensing something he could not quite place. About the meeting earlier, he added cautiously. You handled that well. Charlotte gave a small, controlled nod. It was necessary, she said, but the words felt rehearsed now, like a line repeated without conviction. Mark shifted his weight. You know, people like him usually either argue or apologize. It is predictable. Charlotte's gaze sharpened slightly. Usually, she repeated, and that single word seemed to carry more weight than the rest of the conversation. Mark cleared his throat, sensing the shift. Well, either way, it will not affect anything moving forward. Charlotte did not answer immediately, her eyes drifting past him for just a second, as if replaying something only she could see. That is the problem, she said finally, her voice quieter now, more measured. It did not affect him at all. Mark frowned slightly, unsure how to respond, because in their world, impact was everything, and indifference was either weakness or something far more unsettling. Charlotte turned back toward the window, dismissing him with a subtle nod, and as the door closed behind him, the silence returned, deeper this time, more deliberate. She exhaled slowly, her hand brushing lightly against her temple, not from exhaustion, but from the unfamiliar weight of a question she could not answer. In a world where she controlled outcomes, shaped decisions and dictated direction, one man's silence had introduced something she could not control, could not define, and could not ignore. And for the first time in a long time, Charlotte Hayes was not thinking about winning, she was thinking about understanding, and that shift, quiet and almost invisible, had already begun to change everything. The next morning arrived with the kind of clarity that usually brought structure back into Charlotte Hayes's world, but as she stepped into the executive floor, the atmosphere felt tighter than usual, like something beneath the surface had begun to shift overnight. Voices were lower, movements quicker, and when Mark Ellison approached her with a tablet already open, there was no small talk, no easing into the problem. We have an issue, he said, his tone controlled but urgent. The Westbrook deal is stalling. Charlotte stopped mid-step, her focus sharpening instantly. Define stalling, she replied, already moving toward the conference room, her heels setting a faster rhythm now. Their team flagged inconsistencies in our infrastructure projections, Mark continued, walking beside her. They are questioning the scalability model. Charlotte's expression tightened slightly, not with panic but with calculation. That model was approved 3 weeks ago, she said, pushing the door open, the room already filling with key personnel, screens lit, data scrolling, tension visible in every posture. Approved, yes, Mark replied, but not stress-tested under their revised parameters. Charlotte stepped to the head of the table, her presence immediately commanding the room. Then we adjust, she said, crisp and direct. Run the numbers again. One analyst shook his head slightly. We have been running them all morning, nothing aligns cleanly, another added. If we push forward with the current model, we risk losing credibility. The room fell into a heavy pause, the kind that carried consequences. Charlotte's gaze moved across the table, reading each face, measuring confidence, hesitation, capability, and for the first time in a long time, she did not see a clear path forward reflected back at her. Suggestions, she said, her voice steady but lower now, inviting something deeper than routine responses. Silence answered her, not the empty kind, but the uncertain kind, where no one was willing to speak first. 3 seconds passed, then 5. Then someone shifted in their seat. We could delay, one voice offered, buy time. Another suggested, but even as the words were spoken, they lacked conviction, solutions that protected appearances, not outcomes. Charlotte exhaled slowly, her fingers resting against the edge of the table, her mind moving quickly, searching for clarity, for control, for the decisive edge she was known for. And then, almost without intention, a thought surfaced, quiet but persistent. The memory of a man who had stood in silence while everyone else reacted. She dismissed it immediately, turning back to the data. There has to be a clean solution, she said, more to herself than anyone else. But across the room, near the far end of the table, someone hesitated, then spoke carefully. There might be. The voice was unsure, cautious, but it would require a different approach. Charlotte's eyes shifted toward the speaker. Then say it, she replied, not impatient but focused. The analyst swallowed slightly. Daniel Brooks. He worked on the original framework before it was finalized. A subtle ripple moved through the room, recognition, hesitation, something unspoken passing between them. Charlotte's expression did not change immediately, but the name settled into the space with unexpected weight. He is not in this meeting, Mark said quickly, almost reflexively. For a reason. Another pause followed, heavier this time because the problem on the table did not care about reasons only. Results. Charlotte's gaze lowered briefly to the data in front of her, then lifted again, sharper now, more deliberate. Then bring him in, she said. The room stilled, not from shock, but from the quiet shift of something realigning, because in that moment it was no longer about hierarchy or perception, it was about truth, and the man who had said nothing the day before had suddenly become the only one who might have something worth hearing. The room did not move immediately after Charlotte's words settled into the air, as if everyone needed a second to adjust to what had just shifted, because bringing Daniel Brooks back into this space was not just a logistical decision, it was a quiet reversal of something no one had expected to reverse. Mark Ellison's jaw tightened slightly, his posture stiffening as he glanced toward the door, then back at Charlotte. "You are serious," he said, keeping his voice low but controlled. Charlotte did not look at him, her eyes remained on the data in front of her. "We are not here to be comfortable," she replied, her tone even final. "We are here to be correct." That ended the discussion before it could begin. A junior analyst nodded quickly and stepped out, the door closing softly behind him, leaving the room suspended in a tension that felt different now, less about pressure and more about anticipation. Screens continued to glow, numbers remained unresolved, but attention had shifted, not fully, not openly, but enough to be felt. Charlotte stood still at the head of the table, her hands resting lightly against the surface, her posture unchanged, yet internally something had already begun to recalibrate. Not her authority, not her control, but her certainty. Moments passed, quiet, measured, and then the door opened again. Daniel Brooks stepped in without hesitation, his presence the same as before, steady, unannounced, carrying none of the weight the room had placed on him the day prior. A few eyes flicked toward him, some curious, some cautious, others avoiding him altogether, as if unsure how to engage with someone who had already disrupted the expected script. Daniel's gaze moved briefly across the room, taking in the setup, the tension, the unfinished problem, and then settled naturally on the screen displaying the flawed projections. "You asked for me," he said, his voice calm, neither defensive nor deferential. Charlotte met his eyes for a brief second, and in that moment there was no trace of the edge she had shown before, only focus. "We have a gap in the scalability model," she said, direct, professional. "It does not hold under revised parameters." Daniel stepped closer to the table, setting a simple notebook down, not opening it yet, just placing it there as if marking presence without claiming attention. "Which parameters changed?" he asked, and the question was simple, but it cut through the noise immediately. "Because it addressed the root, not the symptom," one analyst responded quickly. "Load variance and regional distribution factors." Daniel nodded once, absorbing it, then glanced at the screen again, his eyes scanning the data with quiet precision. "You are still anchoring to a fixed baseline," he said after a moment, not raising his voice, not asserting dominance, just stating observation. Mark frowned slightly. That baseline was validated. Daniel looked at him briefly, not confrontational, just clear. "Validated under static conditions," he replied, then turned back to the screen. "These are not static conditions." The room shifted, subtle but immediate, because the clarity in his words did not challenge authority, it refined truth. Charlotte stepped slightly closer, her attention fully locked now. "Then what would you change?" she asked, and this time the question carried no edge, only intent. Daniel paused for a second, then reached for a marker, not asking permission, not hesitating, and began outlining a different approach on the board. His movements measured, efficient, each line connecting to the next with quiet logic. No dramatic explanation, no attempt to impress, just a clear restructuring of the problem into something solvable. The room grew still, not from confusion but from recognition, because what had felt complex moments ago now began to align. And as the solution took shape, something else shifted with it, something unspoken, something deeper than the numbers on the screen. Because the man who had stood in silence the day before was now speaking, and every word carried more weight than all the noise that had come before. The marker stopped moving, and for a brief moment no one in the room spoke, because what Daniel Brooks had just outlined was not only clear, it was undeniable, the kind of clarity that does not demand agreement but quietly earns it. The screen still displayed the old projections, but now they looked incomplete, almost outdated, as if they belonged to a version of the problem that no longer existed. "Run it," Charlotte said, her voice steady, eyes still on the board, and within seconds fingers moved across keyboards, commands entered, models recalculated, the low hum of processing filling the space. Daniel stepped back, not claiming the center, not watching for reactions, just giving the room space to catch up to what he had already seen. It is aligning, one analyst said, his voice carrying a hint of disbelief. Margins stabilize at 12% under load variance. Another added, leaning closer to the screen. Regional distribution holds without overcompensation. A third voice followed, quieter but certain. It works. And just like that, the tension that had defined the morning shifted into something else, something closer to respect, though no one named it out loud. Mark Ellison crossed his arms, his expression tight, searching for a flaw that did not immediately present itself. It is a theoretical adjustment, he said, attempting to anchor the room back into caution. We have not tested it in real conditions. Daniel glanced at him briefly, not dismissing, not challenging, just responding. Then test it, he said simply, and the simplicity of it carried more authority than any argument could have. Charlotte's gaze moved from the screen to Daniel, studying him now, not as an employee, not as a variable, but as something she had misread, something she had underestimated without fully understanding why. How long would implementation take? She asked, her tone measured, precise but different now, stripped of its earlier edge. Daniel considered for a moment, then answered. If the team focuses 48 hours for a controlled rollout, 72 for full integration. The numbers landed cleanly, realistic, grounded. Charlotte nodded once, turning slightly toward the room. Then we proceed, she said, and there was no hesitation in her voice, only decision. Instructions followed quickly, assignments distributed, the machinery of the company moving again, but now guided by a direction that had come from the one person who had been dismissed less than a day ago. As the room began to shift into action, Daniel reached for his notebook, closing it without looking down. His role already complete in his mind. He did not wait for acknowledgement, did not look for approval, he simply stepped back toward the edge of the room, the same quiet presence he had always carried. Daniel. Charlotte's voice stopped him just before he reached the door. The room did not fall silent, but attention tilted, subtle, aware. He turned, meeting her gaze without hesitation. For a second she said nothing, and in that second, the weight of everything unspoken settled between them. The meeting from yesterday, the silence, the shift, the correction. Stay, she said finally, the word. Simple but carrying something different now, not command, not control, but something closer to recognition. Daniel held her gaze for a moment longer, then gave a small nod, not as agreement, not as submission, but as acknowledgement, and returned to the table without a word. And in that quiet exchange something broke, not loudly, not visibly, but deeply. Because the woman who had built her world on control had just stepped into something she could not control. And for the first time she did not try to. By late evening, the office had emptied into a quiet that felt different from the silence of the day before, softer, earned, the kind that follows resolution rather than confusion. The city outside still pulsed with light, but inside the executive floor, only a few scattered lamps remained on, casting long reflections across glass and polished surfaces. Charlotte Hayes stood near the conference room doorway, watching as the last of the team filtered out. Their conversations lower now, more grounded, carrying a tone that had shifted from uncertainty to quiet confidence. The revised model had held, the test results had aligned, and what had seemed fragile that morning now stood firm, not because of force, but because it had been built correctly. Daniel Brooks gathered his notebook without urgency, slipping it into his bag as if the outcome had never been in question. He did not linger, did not wait for recognition. He simply moved toward the exit with the same measured pace he always carried. Daniel. Charlotte's voice reached him again, softer this time, without the edge that had once defined it. He stopped, turning back just enough to meet her gaze. For a moment neither of them spoke, and in that space everything that had happened between them existed without needing to be named. She took a step closer, her posture still composed, but her expression no longer guarded in the same way. About yesterday, she began, then paused, not because she lacked words, but because she was choosing them carefully, something she rarely needed to do. Daniel waited, not expectant, not impatient, just present. I crossed a line, she said finally, the admission quiet but clear. Not dressed in justification, not softened by explanation. The room seemed to hold that sentence for a second, letting it settle into something real. Daniel's expression did not change, but there was a slight shift in his eyes, not surprise, not validation, just acknowledgement. It happens, he replied, his voice even, neither dismissing nor amplifying the moment. Charlotte exhaled slowly, as if something she had been holding without realizing it had just been released. "You did not respond," she said, her tone lower now, more personal. "Most people would have." Daniel glanced briefly toward the window, where the city lights stretched endlessly, then back at her. "Not everything deserves a reaction," he said, the words simple, but carrying the same quiet weight they had held from the beginning. Charlotte studied him for a second longer, and in that second something inside her shifted again, not breaking this time, but settling into place, like a piece of a larger understanding she had been missing. She nodded once, not as a gesture of authority but of respect, a subtle but unmistakable difference. "We move forward," she said, and for the first time the phrase did not sound like a command, but like a shared direction. Daniel gave a small nod in return, then turned and walked toward the elevator, his steps steady, unchanged, as if nothing about him had needed to change at all. Charlotte remained where she was for a moment, watching the space he had just left, the quiet he carried still present even after he was gone. And in that quiet something became clear, not through noise, not through force, but through the absence of both. Because in a world that had always rewarded the loudest voice, it was the man who chose silence, dignity, and restraint who had shifted everything, not by proving himself, but by never needing to. And for the first time the room did not need to be told to be quiet, it simply was. A powerful emotional journey unfolds as a single dad quietly faces public humiliation from a female CEO yet chooses dignity over reaction. This story captures the essence of touching stories where silence speaks louder than pride and control. As tension rises inside a high-stakes corporate world, the single dad reveals unexpected depth and quiet strength, turning doubt into respect. The female CEO begins to question her own actions, leading to a transformation shaped by humility and awareness. Through moments of reflection and redemption, this narrative stands among the most memorable, touching stories that highlight character over status. The contrast between authority and grace creates a compelling dynamic that defines great touching stories. As truth replaces ego, the emotional payoff delivers one of those rare touching stories that linger long after the final moment. This is more than a conflict, it is a lesson in respect, resilience, and the quiet power found in truly touching stories. If this story stayed with you, consider subscribing. There's more like this ahead.